Hi everyone. Thank you very much for sort of taking time out of your day today to listen to this webinar. My name is Danny. I'm a director of Terrafirma here, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about sort of ground hazards and mining hazards in the UK, their legacy, particularly their hidden legacy in many parts of the country, and the sorts of things that we do at Terrafirma. So split this presentation down into a few sections. First things first, I'll introduce Terrafirma, a little bit myself, and go quite quickly into sort of mining in the UK, sort of a mining 101, if you will. Just explain a little bit about the sort of model that we can apply to the country and what's happened historically. Then sort of the main point, I suppose, which is the ground stability that can sort of be impacted from these sort of past mining and also from natural ground hazards as well, and how that impacts property, the conveyancing process in general, and how that can cause some real problems. And then finally, sort of what we do at Terrafirma and how we are aiming to address that problem and sort of solve that problem for solicitors and conveyancers like yourself. So at Terrafirma, sort of we are trailblazers of geodata, really. We are 5 years old, coming up this in August this year, and already got a 25% market share of coal mining reports. We were first commercial company to get the license from the Law Society for the CON20M report, which is the provision of the coal mining report from the Law Society license out, and has been provided from like the Coal Authority for a long time. But we also are sort of branching out and looking into other areas of particularly mining, but also other areas of ground hazards. So that might be non-coal mining, so things like sandstone, limestone, tin, metals, but also things like landslides and coastal erosion and soluble rocks and things, the rocks that dissolve naturally in water, and sort of packaging that up into different products and services for different people. Predominantly, we do that for conveyancing reports, and we aim to sort of transfer the risk from you as solicitors and conveyancers, but also provide really useful and actual actionable advice for sort of the purchaser and the end client, so that they've got actually tangible actions that they can actually take during their transaction to help them minimise any risk that might pose might be at the site. So what is ground stability? Well, it's mainly two things. It's natural hazards, and those are things that are sort of occur naturally and are based on the sort of base natural geology of an area. So like I've mentioned already, that might be if you live near the coast, you might be susceptible to coastal erosion, depending on the types of rocks that are there and how the sea interacts with the land. If you are in a particularly hilly or mountainous area, then landslides and landslips might be an issue. This is sort of an example of a landslip on the right-hand image. You can see the sort of like impact that can cause. Soluble rocks, another one I mentioned, that might be things, that's rocks that dissolve in water. So things like brine and chalk. Chalk, particularly in the southeast of England, covers a really big area, and those rocks dissolve in rainwater and particular types of groundwater, and they actually cause voids under the surface, which then form into things like sinkholes. And on the flip verse of that are man-made hazards, and that's predominantly mining, but there are other things that sort of man have influenced the ground and how that causes problems. Obviously, mining things like mine shafts, sort of the main one, but underground tunnels and voids and sort of road networks that part of that can grow and can collapse, and often sort of the interplay between the two can cause problems. So sort of natural processes can make a man-made hazard worse, and that might cause a collapse. So it's important to consider both during any assessment. So if we think about mining in the UK, what's the first thing that someone might typically think of? Well, the big one that we hear a lot is coal. Obviously, we have a fantastic legacy of coal mining in this country, but that legacy has led and left a sort of very big legacy of mining hazards on our landscape, particularly in the coalfield and the coal mining towns. But coal isn't the only thing that we've extracted from the subsurface over the past 2,000 years, really, of history of mining in the UK. Been lots of non-coal extraction. The big one that people might think of is tin. So Cornwall being sort of a good example of that. If you've been to Cornwall, you've probably seen the engine houses like in the picture on the coast there. And also there's a really big legacy of mining that you can't get away from. I grew up in Cornwall, and it was sort of drilled into me, pun intended, when I grew up. And things like literally the pasties that we eat, those pasties were created from the mining legacy, where that's what the miners used to eat as their lunch, so that they didn't poison themselves with the arsenic that they were often extracting. But there's been over 50, 60 different types of rocks and minerals that have been extracted across the UK throughout literally those past 2,000 years of history, going way back to chalk and flint extraction, sort of in Neolithic times, right through to sort of really recent sort of mining that still occurs today in places like Portland, where you get limestone extraction and gypsum, for example. So mineral extraction is one of our greatest legacies in the UK, and actually you can think of it in the sense that really most things that you see above the surface have probably come from below the surface in some degree. For new developments, a lot of that comes aboard, but historically, actually, that has all been stuff that would have come out of our own industrial sort of revolution and mining legacy. And although mining doesn't happen as much now, and it's a legacy that really kicked off throughout the Industrial Revolution, sort of 19th century, 20th century, it does still occur up today. So this is just a little model of sort of how that extractions typically occurred throughout the sort of Industrial Revolution time through to sort of more the present day, and then sort of how the hazards and those features of those minings sort of influence property and land use today, really. So 1880, mines started to pick up and develop as we started to need resources to build our towns and cities and our infrastructure. That might have been through metals or through building stone or aggregates. And we developed these underground networks and also surface features, so quarries or mine shafts that went down into sort of underground tunnels to extract the resources we wanted. We used those to build our towns and cities, and they grew often around the mines. So we didn't typically have mines in sort of the middle of nowhere sort of very early on, because we didn't have the infrastructure to then get it to the place where we wanted to build things. So we tended to build around our mines. That's why you have the coal mining towns and etc. The problem is as these towns and cities grew and we exhausted the resources, the mines would often be left abandoned, often with no plans, no remediation in place, no legal requirement to do that. Often mine owners would go out of business, and therefore the liability trail would be lost. And what you ended up having was areas and pockets of land in towns and cities that are effectively these old mining areas that, if you move into the present day, are prime for development. And because of the lack of information that can occur through the fact that there's no plans deposited or etc., then often development can be done very quickly without full assessment of those hazards that could exist beneath. And that's where we get into today's picture, where hazards can really impact property through things like sinkholes or mine shaft collapses, etc. In a way, it's linked to our contaminated land legacy as well. It's a similar sort of thing from a mining perspective as well. Things like landfill and old surface quarries that are interlinked. So these things do all sort of interlink and play together. As you can see, that's the sort of thing now, whereas that development that's occurred in recent times sits on top of those features, and those features might have assessed during any sort of either development or even then the subsequent conveyancing process. So this is just a screenshot of sort of the north of the UK, and just going to sort of throw on some of our data on here just to give you an idea of sort of the scale of mining features across the UK. So those are coal mining features. So that's shafts and adits relating to coal mining up in the north. And you can see there's an incredible amount there. Also, we can turn on sort of non-coal hazards as well. And you can see again the sort of scale of the different types, the colours representing different resources, and the points representing a different feature. Those features might be sort of big open cast surface quarries, or they may just be sort of really small individual mine shafts, etc. So big range of scales, as well as sort of the resources that are extracting there. So this is just a map of the UK, which gives you a bit of an overview of the types of mining that's occurred in the UK, really. So the black outlined areas are the traditional and sort of the more well-known coal authority coal reporting areas. But then all the other coloured zones are areas of different types of rocks and minerals that have been extracted throughout the history of the UK. So places like Cornwall, where you can see sort of the bright orange zones, that's your metals, your non-ferrous metals, things like copper and tin. The purple zone that goes through the southeast of the UK is your chalk mining, as I mentioned earlier, and then loads of other different smaller scale types of extraction as well that's occurred across the UK. And obviously also you can see that some of them overlap quite a lot. So again, particularly with the coal areas, there are areas of non-coal mining in areas of coal mining, and often they were done sort of in tandem with each other. So, you know, for example, a Con2M might not always give you the full picture of mining, even though it covers, even though it's a mining report. And then the orange triangles, just to round off, is our sinkholes database that we've been sort of preparing since about 2014 now. This is sort of sinkholes that we've been creating from sort of news articles and media over the past 5 years, and we've built up a database of over 10,000 now. Most of those have occurred since 2014, and they can all be linked to either mining or natural ground stability hazards, and that sort of split between man-made hazards or natural hazards. And you can see sort of the correlation between where they fall in these zones shows that mining has a big influence on where these sinkholes occur. So that was a bit of mining 101. So how do those hazards impact property? How do they impact conveyancing transactions? And how can the risk be missed in certain scenarios? So again, back to sinkholes, we can see that sinkholes seem to be on the rise. That's probably not entirely true, because we just probably are getting better as a country, get better at reporting these events. So they're becoming more prevalent in the media, and actually the media do really like sinkholes because they're sort of hard-hitting, great for their clickbait sort of articles, etc. So they're really good. But at the same time, they are sort of occurring on new build sites as well, and that's because we've started, a process of much more development in this country, and also developing on brownfield land. So therefore, the susceptibility to these hazards is increasing. And the problem is it does have impact on property and land. Since 2016, it's reported as being over £7 million in reported damages. And we know that as well from like the coal authority and their substance claims that they report on as well, that it has a significant impact on financially as well as the obvious physical impacts to the ground and to property. So these are just some pictures of types of sinkholes that have occurred throughout the UK. This was in Norwich, quite a famous case of a chalk mine collapse. It's a case up in the northeast of a coal mine collapse in Gosforth, I believe, and actually that was not that long ago, and a case that was again made national media. Type of non-coal type of extraction. This was a mine shaft collapse in Cornwall. It was incredibly deep mine shaft, and actually what you can see at the bottom there is not the bottom, it's water. So a little bit of a case study to highlight a little bit about how the sort of risk can be missed, I suppose, in particular transactions. So, and also a case of where new builds aren't, not necessarily sort of devolved from the issue. So this was a case in late 2015 in the northeast of England, and again, this made this is quite a high prevalent case that made media, and actually we did an article on, and it revolved around coal mining subsidence and a new development site of around 30 homes, I believe, at the time. The developer had undertaken initial CON2M report from, at the time of their purchase and done their usual site investigation work, but revealed nothing major, and therefore carried on and process development as usual. It went through the conveyancing process again, no data apparent, no issues identified, and therefore no actions were taken. And then within 6 months of people moving into these properties, some really serious coal mining subsidence started to occur. Properties started to crack, as you can see in the image in the centre, and actually some properties started to really shift off their foundations, which was really quite serious. That actually led to the end to over 20 homes being demolished almost 18 months after they were actually sort of sold and moved into, and actually led to one family, I believe, having to move over 20 miles away once they were relocated. So all that disruption that caused. And the reason why that happened is related to, I'll explain here through this map. So this was an article that we wrote for the Land Journal, and just sort of explained why this had occurred and why we believe the risk was missed in this area. So the green sort of highlighted area is the site and development in question, and you can see we've overlaid the coal authority substance claims from recent times to show where the most affected houses were. And you can see there's a coal seam to the south of that site that dips down. That's the orange line, and that dips away from the site. Then there's an area of recorded workings to the north of the site, which is the red hatch zone, and this weird area in between where there's sort of no data at all. And this was the biggest problem with the process, is that because there was no data there was nothing to report on, and therefore sort of the standard answers to the questions came back as no. Because they came back as no, the assumption was that there were no hazards and therefore there was no risk, whereas actually there were hazards there, and there were sort of risks that needed to be sort of addressed. However, they couldn't be because they weren't identified. And this is where what Terrafirma has always been a sort of strong advocate for, and what we've developed from day one, is the importance of data interpretation as well as just data query. So looking at this from a geologist's perspective, it's relatively obvious, especially when you start to piece together other bits of information on top, that this area is susceptible to mining and there are likely to be risks there, even if the data doesn't explicitly say it. For example, you can see that there's an old sandstone quarry that was identified on the site. There's actually a path that runs that quarry up the sort of black dotted line and sort of stops at the face, and what that path is actually an adit entrance. So that's where the path actually starts to go underground, and where they would have probably accessed the coal seam and started mining it. Because it's closer to the coal seam, it's most likely the most oldest workings, which means it's the shallowest workings. And again, this is probably the reason why the data doesn't exist, in the sense that because it's the oldest and the shallowest, it was probably the least likely to have got sort of deposited, and therefore least likely to have been digitized when the coal authority did their digitization projects and onto older maps, etc. So this area in this middle is probably the area of most risky element of the coal mining history of this area, but it's also the least well recorded. So it's really important that interpretation is sort of added to the data to sort of piece together that history. But it's not just coal mining that causes issues, and it's not just the CON2M report that happens with. This is a case, another new build development, but this time related to chalk and brick clay extraction. You know, again, you can see by the age of the buildings and the land around there, this is, you know, brand new development, and there's already been a collapse there. And again, it was because the information wasn't available during the initial development during the conveyancing, and therefore no actions were picked up, and therefore the extra loading of this development caused extra strain on the land, and it's led to and been the catalyst for these sort of collapses to occur. And this site, particularly in the southeast of the UK, was particularly frustrating because there had actually been a collapse here before in the 1920s. And again, it was related to the mining. You can see that on the map here. That is the development there, and that was the collapse that occurred sort of almost 100 years ago now, where actually someone sadly died, and it made the press at the time. And again, it just shows that even though there was a new development here and actually a collapse had already occurred, we don't know what the remediation status of that collapse was, other than just maybe simple infilling. We don't know necessarily the entire network just from a data query. So what's probably happened is a simple infill, but the voids propagated and moved upwards. And again, without that interpretation that really a geologist can provide, then it's very easy to miss those if the data isn't there immediately. So that was sort of how mining and sort of man-made hazards can impact sort of property, and also a little bit about how the risk can be missed, especially when it's just a simple data query. But there are other types of ground sort of stability hazards as well, natural ground perils being sort of one of them as well. And these are things that recognizably, these are things like subsidence in clay that are particularly prevalent in the southeast of the UK, but also can cause collapses like sinkholes. And we've touched on a couple of these already at the start. So things like landslides, soluble rocks, and things like clay subsidence, which is this one causes significant insurance problems every year. So clay-related subsidence, actually, when we have hot and dry summers, a bit like we did in 2018, that actually sort of makes this issue even worse. So subsidence from clay-related soils is due to the sort of contraction and expansion of these clays when they get wet and when they dry out. So when we have particularly wet winters or particularly dry summers, that contraction process is a lot larger. That can really play havoc with sort of the foundations of properties and cause sometimes quite severe cracking and issues for a property. So back in 2018, we actually saw subsidence claims up by over 400% with insurers because of the dry summer we had really added into that process. And we've worked really closely with Cranfield University, or a leading soils university in the UK, and our now new technical and science director, Tim Fairwell, who helped build a model on clay subsidence across the UK, and also how that will likely impact and change with a changing climate that might become more wet or more dry, to really look at how we can model these hazards and how we can best provide information and advice during the conveyancing process. So we can see a map on the left-hand side of sort of the general soil shrinkability is, the technical term that we apply to it, sort of how much clay content's in it. If we add on sort of climate and scenarios onto that, we can start to see which areas are more likely to be at a risk and a hazard of susceptible to these hazards of subsidence in the future. And again, applying that to climate scenarios, we can see that which areas may get worse in the future, even if they're potentially okay now. So we're starting to look at not just current sort of problems and liabilities, but also future problems as well. Other hazards, dissolution. So again, I touched on this at the start, but basically rocks that dissolve in water. Chalk is a big example in the southeast. Doesn't readily dissolve, especially compared to some brine and evaporite type minerals like gypsum. And actually this is something that occurs prevalently in Ripon in the UK, and is the reason why Ripon is dubbed the sinkhole capital of the UK. Because of the number of collapses they get, and it's related to the bedrock geology they've got there, which is sort of a brine evaporite type material that really readily dissolves in water. So the groundwater there is constantly creating new voids, and when those voids become too big, the surface can't support it anymore, and there are collapses. Other hazards, no, running sounds is a perfect example of that interplay between natural and man-made hazards. So running sounds is where you've got really loose material, often near the surface, that can get washed away really easily, hence the running nature in their name. And actually, this is a really common cause of sinkholes, and often probably the most likely reason for a sinkhole that you will see, particularly if you see them sort of in roads, etc. And this is normally because it occurs when utilities fail, particularly water pipes. Those water pipes obviously have incredible pressure in them, and they can really wash away material when they burst. And as they wash that material away, they're creating a void. And often then it only takes say a lorry or extra loading to the surface, or just the void becomes too big before the surface, normally the road above it, collapses away. And then landslips, which we don't get as serious landslips as you might sort of be thinking and what you might expect across the world, particularly sort of on more mountainous areas, etc. But landslides do occur in the UK. South Wales particularly is a prevalent example. And when we have significant storm events, or when we start to deforest hillsides as well, particularly, this can have really devastating impact, because it can really cause not just impact to people's lives and to road networks, etc., but it's also quite a serious risk in terms of risk to life. And actually, in terms of like deaths and fatalities in the UK because of sort of ground hazards, landslips are normally the reason when that occurs. So, for example, during a named storm event in 2017, there was actually a person who sadly died in South Wales because they were sort of taken out by a landslip that occurred on a hillside road. So although more rare, impact much greater when it does occur. And this is an example of a ventnor in the Isle of Wight that is sort of really susceptible to sort of this landslip and ground movement here. And there are parts of the coast there that are really sort of slipping away, and is obviously linked as well to coastal erosion in certain areas as well. So those points on there just represent areas of satellite deformation movement. So basically where we can measure the ground moving, and you can actually see that in certain areas there, we're seeing really quite high downward movements of the ground where we can actually physically detect the ground going downwards, and that's all linked to sort of recent satellite imagery that's been made available through the Sentinel programs that we've been modelling and putting into our reports. So, in terms of natural ground stability hazards, where does it? What's the sort of guidance on this? Well, in 2018, the Conveyancing Handbook was updated around not just mining hazards in relation to the Contour M, but also due to natural ground stability hazards as well. And one of the things that it noted was that we should be looking for affected areas, and particularly a professional opinion and that interpretation on whether property is likely to be affected by not just mining, but also natural ground stability hazards as well. And really looking for the impacts on value and enjoyment of the property. Obviously, all things that will be part of the due diligence process and things that you'll be used to during the search process. So how did Terrafirma identify these sort of hazards? What reports do we offer, and sort of what things do we do to try and to alleviate these risks? Well, first things first, we try to be much more descriptive than the following. Originally, we started off with similar sort of assessments that occurred, but we found very quickly that ultimately often led to more questions than answers. And ultimately, particularly for the purchaser and the end clients, they want some sort of actionable recommendations that they can take forward so they can really understand the risks, especially when we're potentially identifying risks that can seem quite scary or quite impactful to their potentially their dream home or to the property that they've been wanting for a very long time, and that they're putting significant investment into. And from your side as solicitors, we're trying to protect your liability, so that you're clear that you've done all the necessary steps during the due diligence process. We want to make sure that you've got a good professional opinion to stand behind, instead of risks, terms like potential risk that technically don't necessarily mean much. So one report that we offer is the Con2M report. As I mentioned, we were one of the first companies, commercial companies, to be able to provide this report, and we lobbied really hard with the Law Society to be able to do that. And they saw the value really in our interpretation, and the sort of extra value we could add to the data sets, and sort of risk transfer we could add to the sort of conveyancing process, which is why that process happened. And actually that's really driven quite a big innovation in the market. So there are actually now quite a few providers of the Con2M report, and so that it's been good in that sense, because it's driven a sort of advancements in the report, which is to the benefit of yourselves and to the end client. One of those advancements that we started a year ago was inclusion of the monetary interpreter report up front, free and as standard. And the reason why we could do that was because we could start to model these hazards proactively and ahead of time, without the need for sort of expensive further reports. So we started to look at what questions do need to be answered during the process to sort of be useful for yourselves as solicitors, but also to the purchaser. So starting to things like, will any hazards or things identified impact the value? Will there be adverse mining features that the lender needs to be aware of? And also for the purchaser as well, what steps might they need to take? And then by proactively modeling certain features like the monetaries, we can start to include sort of these more advanced reports much more easily and for free and as standard, which is something we've, like I said, we've been offered for a year now. So traditionally, monetaries identified within 20 meters of the property boundary would require a further report, often at a cost of up to £140, £150 to achieve that. But actually, we went through and did a big modelling exercise to process all this monetaries, and actually identified that when you do the calculation that's done alongside that to model the zone of influence, and you take into account the geology, the soil, and the sort of topographical understanding of the ground, the depth of the monetary, its treatment details, etc., we can actually start to build that report in as standard. So we can start to reduce these areas of sort of the standard 20 meters down to the actual zone of influence that we know of the ground, accounting for the uncertainties as well. So this means we can actually fail and not cause transaction delays on as many properties. So we can go from sites like that to this, and actually you can see how many properties now become green. So there's less impact on that transaction likely. And then also where we are identifying those hazards, we can actually then give really clear and sort of more detailed advice and guidance on what to do next. Again, you can see the impact of that. So our Con2M report, which has been out now since July 2018, and in April, just over a year ago now, we updated it to include the Con2M report standard. Really simple design, answers it in a traditional way with the 11 questions and 14 for commercial, so that you've got all the data that you usually expect, but also adding that sort of element of interpretation and assessment onto it as well, and providing sort of our professional opinion, which is ultimately what we want to provide, and help us transfer the risk from you to us. By using and increasing including the monetary interpreter report and things like substance claims as standard, it really increased the pass rate. So there isn't that need for subsequent reports, which not only take time but cost extra money. Things like the user key help users of the report identify what sections are for them. So from a conveyancing point of view, sort of areas in red are ones where you know that there are actions that you need to take, and ones in purple are sort of things you can pass on to the purchaser as sort of prudent advice, without the need for sort of delays and sort of uncertainty on what actions need to be taken. And this is just an example of the monetary interpret report. So that gets included whenever a monetary is identified, it's included as standard and just comes in with the report. And you can see sort of level of detail that one of our geologists will put into this report when it is processed, so that they're calculating the zone of influence and recommending the next best things for both you and your client. And then just a note on sort of brine mining and coal mining, because I'm well aware that they used to be linked in the same report. So the CON2M report used to contain Cheshire brine related information. That's no longer the case. Hasn't been since July 2018, as that provision was taken back out and in-house. However, it's obviously a common misconception sometimes that brine mining and coal mining are really interlinked, when actually those areas are really quite distinct, and actually only overlap in a very, very small area of Stafford. I think there's just under 250 postcodes that are actually affected by both Cheshire brine mining that requires a subsequent report and CON2M report required for coal mining. So just a highlight there that those two aren't necessarily interlinked, and they're quite separate. And that leads us a little bit onto our flagship report, really, which is our ground report. So our ground report contains a CON2M report in it. So you're getting all of the CON2M questions answered, all the assessment, all the benefits of that. So monetary interpret report, substance claims, etc. But crucially, it's adding in that assessment, the professional opinion, and that interpretation for all the other types of ground hazards as well. So non-coal mining, so that's your tins in Cornwall and other parts of the country, sandstone, limestone, things like chalk, places like Cheshire brine, etc. But also as well adds in the natural ground perils, so things like your clay substance, of which there's now a new sort of clay substance module, which has been beefed up with the data with Cranfield University, and got an exclusive relationship with that within sort of the reports. Landslips, places like Ripon, who are affected by natural sort of dissolvable rocks, etc. And there's also information as well on top of all of that for information on radon, fracking, and mineral planning as well, and other things that can influence and impact transaction, maybe on a less physical scale, but on sort of quite enjoyment point of view. So just an example of the sort of new substance module that's been up for a few months now. You can see the data there from Cranfield data that we use that allows us to provide not just a current score, but almost like a projected score for climate scenarios as well. Also, we've incorporated trees into that, and the impact trees can have on substance and clay in clay areas can be quite significant. So we use the national tree model as well to help identify sort of on a rough scale where those trees are, where they will align with areas of sort of high clay susceptibility and the impacts there. And things like the satellite movement that we discussed for Ventnor and the Isle of Wight, we can include that data as well, so you can sort of get an idea of if there's any recorded ground movement that's occurred in the area. So great for sort of as an evidence based on what we're saying. So just go through a few of those points. So improved data, new trees, climate scenarios, and then the evidence base, which is sort of a claims model and also the satellite data model. And that's just an example of sort of the ground movement map that you might see. So you can see the sort of areas of clay string swell in this area, but also then zone of influence of certain trees, and also ground movement in that area too. So those are our current sort of report offerings. Like I said, they're split into two. Really, the CON2M report, which really is a standard for the coal mining, and adds those additional benefits that we think would really help the transactional process, hoping it to help them speed along, but also save money for the client, give them better actions. But sort of the report that we we're really most proud of, which is our ground report, which includes that Terrafirma as standard and all of its benefits, but also touched on all those other hazards and liabilities that can occur from all different types of mineral and mining and natural ground substance and hazards in the UK, of which we have a massive legacy, and providing that in sort of one easy to digest package. That said, we're always looking into the future and other things we can look at. We're moving out into things like coastal erosion next, which will be our probably our next sort of update and things we're looking to do. How we improve that element of, particularly at the moment, it's incorporated in the landscape section, but how do we improve that and actually provide a more comprehensive assessment of coastal erosion? Because in certain areas it's a really big issue, and actually there are areas where properties have literally been are now on the coast, when a while ago, 10, 20 years ago, they were potentially tens of meters away from the coast. And obviously that has massive impact, not just now, but on the future as well, particularly if you come to sell your property, or if that impacts your mortgageability. It's a good example of the sort of thing I'll talk about there, where properties can get closer and closer to the coast, and eventually they will disappear. Things like wildfires, which are hazards that I don't think it's at all assessed within the conveyance process at all. But a few years ago, with that hot dry summer, we saw probably aware of the cases in the media and up in places like the Peak District and stuff, where there were quite some significant wildfires, and where we have vegetation and impacts potentially with a changing climate that could potentially really impact property and people during that process. And things like radon and improving that assessment that we currently use already in the ground report. But again, it's about providing more useful recommendations for people so that they can really understand that risk, because that is a true health hazard that quite often requires testing or remedial action. And so I'll just leave you with a preview video of our current development on National Ground Risk Model. Just gives you, it's a little video of a flyover. This case is around the Ripon area, which shows a little bit about how we can profile and model hazards, and the sorts of things we can do about understanding which properties need further investigation or need further recommendations, and which properties are free from these sorts of hazards. So have a view of the video. Hopefully it's not too glitchy, and see what you think. So as we go through the video, you'll see some properties and areas turning red, and there are pink areas that pile up, and those areas are the ground hazards in this area that have been identified. Triangles represent maybe known collapses or known features of interest, and those reasonings for certain assessments. So thank you very much for listening today. I hope you enjoyed this webinar on the mineral extraction and natural ground stability hazards in the UK, and our legacy, and also the impacts it can have on property. If you have any questions at all, then our website and our email is there. And also please do feel free to contact us at the Search UK team, and I'll happily provide you some useful materials, or we can get in touch and answer any further questions you have as well. Again, thank you very much for listening. Really do hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and please do stay safe in these uncertain times. Thank you.